On the 14th of March, the Court of Appeal in London ruled to quash the convictions of the so-called Birmingham Six, a group of 6 men arrested and imprisoned in 1975 for planting IRA bombs in 2 pubs in Birmingham. Evidence was given in the appeal that the police had fabricated some evidence and suppressed other, and along with new scientific evidence that cast doubt on some of the forensic evidence originally presented, the appeal was upheld and the men released. This came just a year after the successful appeal and release of the Guildford Four under similar circumstances, and on the day of the judgment, Home Secretary David Waddington opened a Royal Commission on Criminal Justice to investigate the failings in the system and what could be done to remedy them. A referendum was held across the USSR on the question of whether to approve a new Union treaty to replace the original 1922 treaty that had created the Soviet Union in the first place. The question asked was, do you consider necessary the preservation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics in which the rights and freedoms of an individual of any ethnicity will be fully guaranteed? Though some republics tweaked the wording slightly, while 6, the 3 Baltic states, Moldova, Georgia and Armenia, boycotted the referendum entirely, having either held or being in the process of arranging their own referenda on complete independence. 80% of voters, on a turnout of about 80%, approved the new treaty, with the more populous and politically powerful states like Russia and Ukraine the least enthusiastic, though still above 70%, and the Central Asian stans well over 90% in favour of keeping the Union together. And with the end of the Cold War and the use of Africa as a proxy battleground, the power vacuums there continued to cause instability. On March the 23rd, a coup attempt in Sierra Leone failed, beginning a brutal civil war that was to last 11 years. Benin, following the fall of its socialist regime the previous year, elected the interim Prime Minister Nicéphore Sorglo to the post, defeating the former dictator Mathieu Kérékou. In unusual scenes the previous year, when Kérékou's government had fallen, he had publicly apologised to the people and gone on state television to beg forgiveness from the Archbishop of Cotonou. After losing the election in March 1991, he withdrew from politics entirely, at least for the time being. And a protest march in Bamako against the Malian dictatorship of Moussa Traoré was violently suppressed, and a couple of days later Traoré was toppled in a coup, replaced by the head of his own palace guard, Amadou Toumani Touré, who promised to transition to democracy. And so to Brazil, where most teams had come straight from the US and were in any case planning to introduce new cars at the next race in Imola, so there was little news on the technical front, though the Williams team back home had been hard at work on the semi-automatic gearbox, with test driver Damon Hill providing a lot of miles worth of feedback, and they thought they had the kinks mostly worked out of it. Though the change from 5th to 6th and vice versa was still sticky, so they were trying a 5-speed version of the box in Brazil. Ferrari, meanwhile, were confidently predicting that they'd go better here as the Interlagos circuit suited the car much better than Phoenix. And so the Coloni, Dallara, Fondmetal, Jordan and Modena Lamborghini teams got up bright and early on Friday morning to pre-qualify, and it was JJ Leto's turn to top the table, with Pirro 4th sandwiching the 2 Jordans. The top 4 were covered by a smidge over a second, and then there was another 1.3 seconds back to Van der Poel, another 1.1 back from him to Larini. Guiar had been looking good in an intermediate chassis until the suspension broke and forced him back into the old car, and wound up nearly 4.5 seconds off Leto's time. Qualifying proper was always going to be Senna's gig at his home circuit, and he took his 54th pole without too much trouble. And while Alesi was second in the wet on Friday, all that went out of the window in a dry Saturday session, so it was Riccardo Patrese who joined Ayrton on the front row, knocking his teammate back into the second row in the dying minutes, with a hacked-off Mansell and Berger behind them. Then Alesi over a second behind Senna and a 10th ahead of Prost. 2 more Brazilians were on row 4, Nelson Piquet and a delighted Mauricio Gugelmin, whose Leighton House car seemed to be improving all the time. Modena put the Tyrrell 9th after destroying his car in qualifying, and Gasho the Jordan an excellent 10th, just ahead of an equally delighted Eric Bernard. De Cesaris in the second Jordan was 13th, with a painful leg after flipping his windsurfer and landing awkwardly on the keel. He would be lining up alongside the 4th Brazilian in the race, Roberto Moreno, who just couldn't get the old Benetton balance right. Capelli in the second Leighton House was 15th, the 2 Finns 19th, Leto, and 22nd, Hakkinen, with Comas making his debut from 23rd, and Tarquini 24th, amid rumours that the AGS team were in dire enough financial straits that they might not even make it to Imola. while the Brundle brothers took up the last row, telling journalists that the car was, quote, too old, too heavy, has too much drag, and is underpowered. Neither of the footworks ever looked much like qualifying, Caffey almost a full second behind Brundle, with Johansson suffering from excessive oversteer, and an unlucky Bailey forced to use Mickett's car after his own broke, and the team have no spare. Hometown hero Senna had been extraordinarily unlucky on home tarmac over the years. In 1985, his first year with Lotus, he dropped out with electrical problems. Then in 1986 he was on pole, but came home second to Piquet's all-conquering Williams Honda. He was third on the grid behind the Williamses the following year and had an engine failure. 1988 was the year of McLaren domination, but while Senna was on pole again, he was disqualified and Prost won. In 1989, Senna was on pole again, only to be clobbered by Berger at the start and finish a lap down after repairs. And then last year, poleman once again, he was taken out by Nakajima while in a comfortable lead, so the build-up to the third Grand Prix in his hometown of Sao Paulo could scarcely have put more pressure on him to finally break his duck. Needless to say then, Interlagos had its usual bumper crowd, despite the windy, overcast late summer weather, as Sunday morning's warm-up and support races got underway. Gugelmin had a moment in free practice when his fire extinguisher went off in the cockpit, leaving him with some nasty-looking chemical burns, but he was keen to race and was past fit by Sid Watkins, so there would be a full grid for the race in the afternoon. It had rained in the morning, and while the rain had stopped and the track in the warm weather had dried sufficiently to start on slicks, it was still slippery off the racing line. Aguri Suzuki's fuel pump failed as they set off for the parade lap, and he was pushed into the pit lane, but it proved unfixable, so 25 cars would take the actual start. Away they went, with Senna rocketing off into the lead, while Mansell got ahead of Patrese into second. Alesi had got up into fourth as Berger's McLaren emitted a plume of smoke and a lick of flame before apparently changing its mind and getting going, unlike poor Gabriele Tarquini, who didn't do much for the prospects of the continued existence of AGS and his own employment by locking up and sticking it in a barrier. Roared on by the crowd, Senna put his foot down and charged, pulling out a gap to Mansell, who was in turn leaving Patrese behind. Mansell stabilised the gap at about a second and a quarter, and for the time being not much changed at the front. Prost was dogging Piquet's rear wing as they scrapped over the last point, and Gasho in 10th was likewise harassing Gugelmin in 9th, until on lap 9 the Brazilian came into the pits to give up, still in excruciating pain from his legs. He was lifted from the car and limped away, but at least he could say he'd tried. And now Gasho was on the defensive, with Roberto Moreno nipping at his wheels, having already disposed of De Cesaris in the other Jordan. So, with 10 of the 71 laps gone, Senna led Mansell, Patrese, Alesi, Berger and Piquet in the points positions, with Prost still in 7th and apparently unable in his brand new V12-powered Ferrari to do anything about the year-old V8-powered Benetton in front of him, with Modena holding 8th ahead of the Gasho Moreno scrap over 9th. On lap 13, Nakajima and the other Tyrrell spun out, the ever-honest Japanese driver putting his hands up and admitting he'd just messed up, just as Senna began to lap back markers, first up being Mark Blundell. Still, at least Senna couldn't trip over Satoru again this year. With all the cars starting on soft C compound tyres, a single pit stop was expected, but Prost came in very early on lap 17, hoping to steal a march on the rest, and probably just frustrated by being stuck behind Piquet. A decent stop got him back out in 11th, just as Capelli rolled to a stop with transmission failure. He was joined a couple of laps later by Stefano Modena with a broken gear linkage. Mansell, meanwhile, had closed up on Senna, but decided on lap 20 to pit for new tyres. 4 off, 4 on, dropped the jack, and the gearbox refused to engage first. Eventually, after 14.6 seconds stationary, Mansell erupted out of the pit box and, presumably swearing liberally, set off to try and catch up, rejoining 5th. So it was Senna, Patrese, Alesi, Berger and Mansell, and with a lead of over 20 seconds and a blisteringly quick stop, Senna was able to pit without losing the lead. He'd felt his first set of Goodyears was slightly underinflated and had radioed ahead for the team to stick a bit more air in his second set, which they'd duly done. A flying Mansell got past Berger and Alesi off camera. A lot of things not involving Ayrton Senna happen off camera in Brazil, and a flying Patrese was also closing hard on Senna, getting the gap down to just over 3 seconds before making his own stop. No gearbox troubles there, and he was underway and back out in 6th, which rapidly became 4th when Berger and Alesi both came in together on the next lap. So Senna now led Mansell again by about 7 seconds as half-distance approached, with Piquet third, about 12 seconds behind Nigel and 8 seconds ahead of a charging Patrese, who was reeling him in at a second a lap. Soon Ricciardo was right up behind Nelson and breezed past pretty much on the stroke of half distance. The gap between Senna and Mansell, meanwhile, was coming down as well, as Prost made a second stop on lap 39. A good stop, but the fact he'd stopped at all was going to be a problem. Alesi came in shortly afterwards, so there seemed to be something wrong with the Ferraris, who were now running 6th and 8th, either side of Moreno. Mansell had the gap down to just over 3 seconds by now, while Piquet, non-stopping and with a slipping clutch in 4th, now had Berger on his tail. Soon enough the McLaren was passed, and Piquet decided to stop. On lap 47, got away well, and only lost 1 place to Prost. And suddenly Mansell was dropping back, lapping slower than Patrese, and came in for new tyres. He'd picked up a cut in his tyre from some on-track debris. Another slightly hairy stop as the front jack got stuck under his front wing, but he was away again, and still in second, as Pierluigi Martini blotted his copybook by beaching his car on the curbs. Short of another piece of Senna's bad luck, it looked like it was all over by the shouting, and there would be a lot of shouting if he won, as Senna came round to lap Alesi. Williams weren't the only ones with gearbox troubles though. Senna's more traditional stick shift had mislaid 4th, but at this stage he wasn't too concerned. Eric Comas's debut came to a smoky end as his Lamborghini engine went bang, and then it was Mansell spinning. His gearbox was at it again, shifting up 1, 2, 3 and then failing to find 4th. He recovered and got going, only to immediately pull over and retire. Between the actual start and 2 long pit stops, the gearbox had essentially been subjected to 3 racing starts, and a 4th, recovering from the spin, had just been too much. So it was left to Patrese to take up the cudgels in pursuit of Senna, but he was 40 seconds behind with 11 laps to go, with Berger 8 seconds behind him and aiming to make it a McLaren 1-2. But Senna seemed to be having problems. His engine was sounding very rough through slower corners. He'd actually lost 3rd and 5th gears with just 7 laps to go and was grimly just keeping his car in 6th all the way round at the brink of stalling it in the slower corners. Patrese was taking lumps out of Senna's lead, as Gasho's fuel system gave up the ghost almost within sight of the end. He'd been running 7th. The gap was down to 9 seconds with 3 laps to go, but Patrese was having gearbox problems of his own, sometimes skipping a gear when downshifting. Lap 69 of the 71, the gap was down to 5.4 seconds and it was looking like it was going to be a photo finish. And then it started raining, just as they all began the last lap. Senna was frantically gesticulating at the sky, indicating the race should be immediately stopped, a bit late by this point, but in fact the rain had helped him, as Patrese, with his own dodgy gearbox and unaware of what problem Senna might have had, decided that 6 points were the better part of valour and eased off. Ayrton Senna won the Brazilian Grand Prix at the 7th attempt in a competitive car, and the McLaren team broadcast his jubilant and barely coherent screaming over the pit car radio to the world as he limped to a halt and stalled in the middle of the track. Patrese was second, 3 seconds behind him, probably frustrated to hear afterwards that if he had just pushed hard on that last lap, he probably would have won. Berger came in 3rd for his first podium visit since Italy last year, with Prost and Alesi salvaging points for Ferrari after a very disappointing weekend, and Piquet sending the B190 off with a pair of points himself. Moreno was just outside the points in 7th, Morbidelli a lonely 8th, and Hakkinen making his first Grand Prix finish in 9th place, 3 laps down. Boutsen, Pirro and Brundle were the last cars still running, though Gasho had also gone far enough to be classified. Senna later said that it had been his hardest race since his 2nd ever Grand Prix, when he scored his first point in South Africa, having damaged the nose cone and radiator on his Tolman early on and driven the entire race with an evil-handling, overheating car and had to be lifted out of the cockpit from the effort. So, celebrations for Brazil and Senna, whose 31st birthday had been on the Thursday of race weekend. Frustration at Williams as their gearbox woes apparently still weren't sorted, and long faces at Ferrari. But with so many new cars coming at Imola and 4 weeks between races, there was still a long way to go in the season. But it was 2 for 2 for McLaren and Senna so far.